Today's lesson is for Unit 2, Lesson 12, using square roots to solve equations. So when you're calculating out the square root of just a simple equation, so for example, x squared equals 256, when you take the square root, think of it as taking the square root of both sides. So the square root of x squared, that's how we're getting x, and then the square root of 256. What's important is that this plus or minus. So when we're working now with equations, our answer could be a positive square root of 256. So when we calculate that out, it could equal a positive 16 or it could equal a negative 16. So there's two possible answers when you're taking the square root of a number. You would have the positive number and the negative number. So with equations, make sure we're using both options for our answers. As another example equation, notice this one, there is a coefficient with that x squared. So when you're taking the square root, before you do that, you want your x squared term to be by itself. Even though 9 is a perfect square, it's easier in the end if we get x squared by itself. So we would divide by 9. So 9 divided by 9. And so we would be left with x squared. And since both of these are actually perfect squares, I would leave them both as perfect squares. So we'd have 16 over 9. And if you take the square root of each side, you would have x equals plus or minus. Think of this as the square root of 16 over the square root of 9. So x would be equal to plus or minus square root of 16 is 4 over the square root of 9, which is 3. So x equals plus or minus 4/3 for this one. And you could have taken the square root initially also. So 9 times x squared equals 16. Since they're both perfect squares, you could square root right away. And you'd have 3x equals plus or minus 4. And then dividing by 3, you end up with the same answer. X equals plus or minus 4/3. One more example. Your goal with this, so this one is a multi-step equation, but your goal is still to get that x squared term by itself. So you want to work backwards to get that term by itself. So we have, first, if we're subtracting 12, you end up with 4 times x squared equaling 256. And then the next step to get x squared by itself, if we divide by 4 on each side, we're left with x squared equals 64. And then taking the square root on each side, square root of x squared is x. Square root of 64, we end up with plus or minus 8. So there's two answers. It could be a positive 8 or a negative 8 to satisfy this equation.